time. And I thought, like, well, so I started asking people this week. Some of you may have gotten texts from me texting, well, what's the greatest love song you know? And so I wanted to share some of these. So I thought it'd be funny-ish and also kind of help us to like see some of the ways that we still write about love songs. I want you to imagine trying to translate these songs 1,000 years from now. When someone is looking back at the English language and says, I know what this word literally means, but why are they saying it here in a love song? You know, it's just, I think, because sometimes you come to Song of Solomon, and we're like, there's great debate over what these words mean, how they're being used. And there's all these, so many love songs are full of wordplay, even, like puns and all sorts of things that would be really hard to translate later, you know. There's too many songs to pick from. I should have narrowed the list down. Like a river flows, surely to the sea, darling, so it goes. Some things are meant to be. What about, let me see here. Oh, this one. I needed the shelter of someone's arms, there you were. I needed someone to understand my ups and downs, there you were, with sweet love and devotion, deeply touching my emotion. I closed my eyes at night, wondering where I would be without you in my life. Everything I did was just a bore. Everywhere I went, it seems I'd been there before. But you brighten up for me all of my days with love so sweet in so many ways. Highway run into the midnight sun. Wheels go round and round. You're on my mind. Restless heart, sleep alone tonight. Sending all my love along the wire. There's just so many. Let me see. Kiss me out of the bearded barley, nightly beside the green, green grass. Swing, swing, swing the spinning step. You'll wear those shoes and I will wear that dress. Oh, kiss me beneath the milky twilight. Lead me out on the moonlit floor. Lift your open hand. Strike up the band and make the fireflies dance. Silver moon sparkling, so kiss me. I mean, I'm trying to translate that in another language, right? Like, think about that. Just seriously, as you think about these love songs that we write, and we hear them like, oh, it makes total sense. I get it, right? And then like you try to translate that, add 1,000 years of history. People are like, what? Fireflies? Like, what did that? Like, what's going on? Well, how does that fit into this? What kind of emotion does this bring up? Feels like I'm standing in a timeless dream of light mists with pale amber rose. Feels like I'm lost in a deep cloud of heavenly scent, touching, discovering you. Those days of warm rains come rushing back to me. It's just like, you know, we have all these ways of talking about these things that, you know, still are kind of perplexing to us, maybe even today, you know? I want you in my arms, let me hold you, I'll never let you go again like I did. I would never fall in love again until I found her. I said I would never fall unless it's you I fall into. Anyway, there's so many songs. No count of gold placed in my hand, the largest find, the greatest sum. Though some would say it ease our pain, we know that it can't be done. Not even the sun, not even the clouds, not even the past, no nothing this world could bring or anything someone could do could hold me back from you. There's so many more. Maybe in the ensuing weeks I'll read some more. But I want you to think about these. Some of these songs are writing about how they lay awake at night and think about how far away their beloved is. Other songs are talking about, in these just like poetic ways, kissing next to the foliage, you know, like bearded barley and fireflies and twilight, and that's like very Song of Solomon language, right? I thought that was really striking, and it made me actually kind of appreciate with a great appreciation how the Song of Songs really is, I think, the song of songs. I think it really is the quintessential love song, and even still, like the great love songs of our time are kind of stealing the tricks and the language of this song. And to me, that helped me appreciate, again, why this song might be in here. I think we can go through all this. This is all the stuff we went over in the introduction class. But I think it's the fourth one here. We're looking at a dramatic pastoral poem. There's a lot of pastoral imagery, shepherding, and kind of farming, and all sorts of, lots of dramatic moments in a male-female relationship. I don't think it's an anthology. I think it really is kind of the last one. It's at least these love poems expressing this male-female relationship, and they are a unified love poem. We're going to see that tonight as the sections don't have clear endings. People have organized this book all sorts of ways, but really it all flows and is threaded together to make a single song out of a kind of collection of songs. And these ideas about what it means that it's poetry, we went over this. I'm going through this quickly. If you weren't in class a couple weeks ago, you can go back and watch it and get greater detail on all of this. It actually is very familiar to the ancient Near East. Mesopotamia, Babylon, Egypt, all had love poetry that was similar to this book. And all those books, the woman speaks twice as much as the man. They're all made up of I and thou statements, very personal, like straightforward you and me. Lovers are either anticipating or sharing, longing for intimacy, and there's these detailed physical descriptions of the beloved. And these are kind of the three, these are really important to consider as we get into this book. The Lord owns creation, reproduction, mating, and courtship, so his authorized love language builds up while expressing healthy sexual passion. This is really important, I think. As many Christians, maybe you can relate to this, grew up with kind of, I would call sex-negative theology, which just is a fancy way of saying, because we don't like to talk about things straightforwardly, just in families and cultures where we don't talk about it, and we don't ever talk about how good it is or how beautiful it is, how right it is. We kind of say no, 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 and they get married, and we kind of expect people to kind of figure it out. And that, honestly, is not how God talks about it. Just that's what this book is here for, in a sense. This book shows the ideals God has for it, and it's almost startling, the ideals, because it seems like these people aren't living in the real world, broken by sin, broken by all the hurts and the pains, and how relationships, like where these things are involved, are kind of the biggest area for the greatest hurts. And it seems like these two are just kind of living in this pre-sin world where everything is just as it ought to be. But I think there's a reason for that. I think it highlights what God intended for this relationship to be, how transcendent love can be, how transcendent it ought to be. To show that there are similarities between the Lord's passion for his people and the passion spouses have for one another. A picture that prophets like Hosea will later know. And this one is unbelievable, right? The way we long and anticipate and look forward to being with our beloved, that kind of singular longing is how God feels for us. And that's crazy, right? I mean, that's a hard thing to process. Maybe finally to show Christ's love for his people, the church is like married love. So that's real quick, all the stuff we went over a couple weeks ago, basically. We went over this kind of the general structure. This is breaking down what was going to be 5 weeks, and now be 4 weeks. Hopefully we'll get through the first 2 sections tonight. But it's a kind of the structure it's called a chiastic structure. And it starts off with a section of anticipation that's mirrored in the last section by affirmation. And the middle sections, 2:8 through 3:5 and 5:2 through 6:3, are filled with these kind of finding, losing, and finding. Losing and finding. We'll see that tonight in the second section we look at, where they're talking about seeking. I sought, I'm seeking, I'm finding, I'm lost. I saw him, I saw her, it was beautiful. You know, and in the middle section we have what seems to be their marriage and the consummation of their love. And a lot of the kind of the definition of these are these sections where it says, don't stir love until it's ready. Don't stir love until it pleases. So if you remember last week, I asked these questions, and we didn't have time to answer them. If you're here, you had some time to think about it. But if not, we can think about this right now. Why would God give us a book of love songs, like Song of Solomon, that glorifies male-female relations when Proverbs warns against adultery? What does this show us about God's view towards sex? What do you think about this? Kind of balances it out, right? To some extent. Ricky?
He had a design.
Mm-hmm.
And if you follow his plan, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
And so, so in a sense, like Song of Solomon presents the positive kind of ideal, whereas Proverbs can balance it out. And Proverbs has the positive in it as well, by the way. Proverbs is not negative, but it is warning, right? Proverbs is full of warnings, especially to young sons. You can see why there's so many warnings against adultery and against fornication and against these things. Good. What else? What does it show us about God's view towards sex? These are very uncomfortable conversations we're not used to having in Bible class, which I totally understand. I think it's important to look at these things, and this is the exact reason that these questions need to be asked, is because, not that we should be talking about them all the time or just always be open about all these things. I'm not trying to push towards that. But we need to, as Christians, be able to appreciate that God He created these things. He created this relationship, and he created the relationship to be engaged in this way. And if we don't appreciate, if we can't appreciate it or look at it and look at it straight in the eye and see it for what it is, then there's a lot of, I think, bad things that come from that. Whether it be talking to our children, or whether it be misunderstanding our spouses, or not appreciating values of certain parts of our relationship. And this book highlights kind of the ideal of how two beloveds feel for each other, and sometimes we can start to go through the motions in our relationships. These things can be really convicting and challenging if we are in maybe a bad phase or in a low point, and that can be perplexing and frightening, or can be just discouraging, right? But God has a mind for it and a high view of it. It reminds me of the book of Job, when God has this joyful view of Job, and then he has a joyful view of even this Leviathan, whatever it is. He's super excited about it. Or the book of Ecclesiastes, where the preacher says, hey, everything's hevel, everything's smoke or vanity or whatever you put. And it's kind of like, it should be that way. And the books of wisdom take us through all these things where we are so perplexed by them, and God says, I made this the way it is. You should love it. Kim?
Well, I think you were saying it balances it out, but I think it also is another example of how everything God has made, man has made sinful. And so it shows that, we have turned it taboo. We have turned it sinful. We have a way of taking anything pure and good and making it evil. And so it's just another example of that in here, that, what God had created was not for evil. It was not for sin's use. But yet man abused that so much that, the warnings are everywhere. And we see it with all these great kings of Israel that, So anyway, it's just another example of that.
No, I think that's a good way of looking at it. And I think that we should take some warnings from that as well, where it's we don't want to just be so influenced by how broken the world is with these things that we can't then emphasize or appreciate the design God had for it in the first place, right? And lean into that. Good. What about this? So I believe the whole book is written, and it's not written chronologically in a sense. I think it's written by kind of these moments of emphasis, and it has a build-up and a kind of a letdown in a sense, like a climactic and anticlimax of the book. And I think that because the way they talk about each other, this is, you have to put this in the context of the whole Bible. The way they talk about each other and the way they think about each other and engage with each other, it is very much like they're already married. And as I read it, that's, Anyway, and so I think that, interestingly, looking at this idea of these love songs, it's of a married couple, but it's punctuated by periods of losing and finding. We're going to see that tonight, hopefully. I've already said that, but why do you think that's the case? Why would songs about the love of a married couple be punctuated by periods of losing and finding? I think there's simple, straight, surface level answers, but there's also maybe deeper answers to this question. I think there's lots of ways to look at this. Which, by the way, that's what poetry is great for. It has lots of levels to it.
Every great love song has loss.
Yeah, right? So that on one level, it's you can't, it's the loss is part of it. It's that's just, there's nothing else to say to that. Good, what else?
Greater appreciation for what you have when you do find it.
Yeah. Yeah, great appreciation for what you do have when you do find it. And I think also, I think one of the things the Song of Solomon, this book articulates, is that the anticipation in some ways is as great as the consummation, which is literally everybody would say that's not the case, right? But this book presents it in a way where they long for each other, and it's presented in this praise and the words and the ways that they talk, the words they come up with. It's all the greatest love songs come after a huge breakup, right, in our day. It kind of feels like that, where it's the greatest language they have for each other when they're just longing for each other, when they're away from each other. And that kind of praise and adulation, that kind of just the beautiful magnification of their beloved that they say when they're apart, it just couldn't happen any other way. And I think that this it starts to make sense also. It's just the case, People go on business trips and married couples are separated. And how do you think about that? How do we handle that, And how do we how does this, I think these love songs speak to mundane aspects of relationships like that. Or even this starts to, I think, speak to periods where, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it also just seems like couples ebb and flow in how we feel about each other. And these poems, I feel almost in a way, in a secondary way, almost speak to that, where there is kind of a variance in closeness as a relationship goes. Any relationship goes. But the beautiful thing is when you come back together, when you get reunited, the love that you have, and it makes you realize again that period of loss, you can appreciate it in some sense. Like I think about this. I was talking to one of my mentors, and I was talking about this, and he was talking about how like this is, this prepares you for the eventuality when one of the members of the couple is going to die. And like this idea of these songs, not that nothing can prepare you for that, but in a sense, like when you think about that, like there is this kind of path that a relationship takes. And then even from at the end or the beginning, like the beginning when you find that person, it's like you didn't realize what you had lost for the whole period of your life before then, right? That's the kind of the grand romanticism of this song, that you don't even know what you had lost until 30 years into your life. You realize I haven't had this for 30 years, or however long it is. And so I think it just, again, like even to Dave's point more succinctly than me, just putting it just like it does just, the times of loss and pain deepen the appreciation for the greatness. All right, so how can this book be used for us to gain wisdom? Or how could it be used to share wisdom with our children? This may be the most directly applicable and also most challenging of the questions. How can we gain wisdom from this book, and how might we use it to share wisdom with our children? Kim?
Well, the simple is don't stir up love.
Yeah.
Because that's such a great lesson for people on the other side of that. We understand what that means.
Yeah.
But for young ones, they don't understand what that means sometimes. Yeah. So that's a really basic one.
No, I think that's one of the great ones of seeing this, right? Because those lines we're going to see tonight, those lines come in the context of like the beauty of it, like how wonderful this is. And it's almost like in this first section, it's almost like, wow, our relationship is so connected and so beautiful. And in the middle, it's almost like she breaks in and says, hey, don't awaken love until it pleases. Like, make sure like this is appropriate when it's appropriate. And it's great when it's great, but if it's not, it's going to be ruined. And so this song, as it goes through all the beauties of it, it kind of intersperses throughout it how careful you have to be with this. And then it ends with this section, right? Its flashes are of fire, the very flames of the Lord. The love is as strong as death. Jealousy is severe as Sheol. And sometimes we can even, ironically, kind of cut out the rest of this book and just tell kids, hey, love's like fire. You got to be real careful with it, And then like you pointed out, Kim, when you read that section and put it in with all its context, it's like, wow, this is such an amazing thing. Make sure that you keep it. Do what you can to build towards that or to anticipate it. Good. What else? How else might we use it to teach our children? Kara?
I just think, like, in our current culture, that we're, like you were mentioning before, that we are told often that, like, that sex leads to sin and all of these terrible things. And when we're parenting, that is a lesson that needs to be communicated.
Yeah.
And it's also needs to be communicated what God created it for, and the joy and the goodness that's in it. So.
Yeah. And that balance is hard. Like I'm saying these things as idealistically as someone who hasn't had these conversations with my child or children yet. But I do think I've heard growing up in and around Christian folks, I've heard and seen ideas put like this, especially towards young women, where it's like, hey, if you lose your virginity, you're tainted forever. And it's like, okay, you can read the Old Testament, you can see things like that idea, but I just think that's one of the worst things you could, if you're gonna say one thing to someone about this, if that's the only thing a young girl hears, that's horrible. And the Bible just doesn't talk about it that way. It has a more complete picture. And so if we have to be real careful, and we can't, I think it's easier sometimes to teach biblical wisdom out of a fear-based source rather than a love-based source. And if you're just afraid of your kids making mistakes, you'll never actually teach them in a way that builds them up. And you'll never be able to engage closely with them, put your arm around them and say, hey, let's figure this out together. In good times and in bad times, right? Because we have to imagine that our kids are going to make some mistakes. But if we never talk to them about these things, or we never engage them, or we never talk to them how great it could be, we never give them any positive motivation, only negative. When they do mess up and there's only negative motivation, the next motivation will be, all I have to do is hide this now. Because there's nothing good now. There's nothing good. It's all negative. And so we have to be real careful about these things, because if we're too prudish or too uncomfortable or self-conscious to have these conversations in their fullest, in a balanced way, and when we present one side, right, it's not going to go well for our kids. That's my hypothesis. That's my opinion. Any other thoughts about this? Dave?
I'm just kind of thinking about this, and it makes me think about like Adam and Eve and the apple. Satan's telling them all it'll be okay. Well, in my growing up, you go to school, you hear all the stuff, and then of course you don't want to hear it from your parents.
Yeah.
And so, that's why, I don't know. Yeah, it makes me think that you need to talk to your kids sooner about it.
Yeah.
So that they understand before they're exposed to what all their friends are going to start telling them about it.
Have you guys looked at the average age that children are exposed to pornography in our culture? Not to make this class really depressing, but it's like 10 and younger. And so, to your point, Dave, like if we want to talk about these things, we want to beat the world to the punch. It's shockingly young when we have to start these conversations. And yeah, I don't know all the ways that looks. I couldn't give you wisdom from experience about how to have those conversations. But what part of my motivation to make sure we didn't miss this book is to say these conversations, we have to be engaged in them. No matter how uncomfortable we get talking about it or how much failure we might bring to this in our own personal lives or as parents, the failure we might have, it doesn't matter. Like we have to think about this and look for growth in this area. Rick, and then we'll move on.
The one problem that I've had to deal with, and it takes everything that everybody said, and I take it to a level where my middle daughter, the things that she suffered as a baby, being sexually molested, and then she's trying to learn how to be a woman, and it goes beyond everything that you guys are saying, and I understand that in a normal mindset. And here's a child that has to deal with this day in and day out, in the mental. I can't. It's just you can't even imagine.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about is on a normal. Everybody here, most everyone here has a normal family.
Yeah.
But when you're brought into something like that as a child, and then you're trying to live with that kind of stuff that happened that had nothing to do with you, and come to a mindset that, and like I told Courtney, I said, look, considering some of the things that you could be doing, I'm happy with you, because she could really be in some fouled up things.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, man, I as a foster dad, I heard stories that children have to go through. I mean, babies.
Yeah.
And then they grow up. How do they get a normal, with God's word? It's just like God told Job, look, the Leviathan, the behemoth, the goats on the side of the mountain.
Yeah.
Try to come to me.
Yeah.
And I'll help you through it the best way. But in the meantime, there's things that mentally people have to deal with that is just stomach, mind wrenching, and they have to deal with it every day, day in and day out.
Yeah.
And you try to use God's word, but it goes beyond normal.
Yeah.
And it's a tough.
That's one of the striking things about this book. Is like I said already, it seems to exist in a world where sin doesn't. And what it does, I think, to your point, like God is not shy about his ideals, about the good he's placed in this world, and it still exists, even though the bad exists, even though, to your point too, Ken, even though the brokenness and the sin exists, the beauty and the very flame of the Lord exists in this, and that's just a hard thing to appreciate. So, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, those are, I know that. Yeah.
It's a how do you get there? How do how do you get there? I need help. Other the prayers, but it's something that she's got to. Man, I can't even imagine.
Yeah. I'm so sorry to hear that.
Well, that's
Well, we need to get into this text. We only have 17 more minutes left. We'll get through some of this. I'm going to engage in some lecturing, not commonly my practice, but through a lot of this, I figured it'd be better to lecture. And I've interspersed a couple of discussion questions between sections, but mostly I'm just going to kind of walk through. If something doesn't make sense, if you have a question about part of the text, feel free to ask, and we'll get into that. All right, the first section, like I pointed out here, is 1:2 through 2:7, and it really is just, I think it's one section together, and there's a lot of different voices speaking. I'm going to read through this section and then go back and talk about it. All right, Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 1. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. May he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. For your love is better than wine. Your oils have a pleasing fragrance. Your name is like purified oil. Therefore the maidens love you. Draw me after you and let us run together. The king has brought me into his chambers. We will rejoice in you and be glad. We will extol your love more than wine. Rightly do they love you. I am black but lovely. O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not stare at me because I am swarthy, for the sun has burned me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me caretaker of the vineyards, but I have not taken care of my own vineyard. Tell me, O you whom my soul loves, where do you pasture your flock? Where do you make it lie down at noon? For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? If you yourself do not know, most beautiful among women, go forth on the trail of the flock and pasture your young goats by the tents of the shepherds. To me, my darling, you are like my mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with strings of beads. We will make for you ornaments of gold with beads of silver. While the king was at his table, my perfume gave forth its fragrance. My beloved is to me a pouch of myrrh, which lies all night between my breasts. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of En-gedi. How beautiful you are, my darling, how beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves. How handsome you are, my beloved, and so pleasant. Indeed, our couch is luxuriant. The beams of our houses are cedars, our rafters, cypresses. I am the rose of Sharon, the lily of the valleys. Like a lily among thorns, so is my darling among the maidens. Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved. So is my beloved among the young men. In his shade I took great delight and sat down, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He has brought me to his banquet hall, and his banner over me is love. Sustain me with raisin cakes, refresh me with apples, because I am lovesick. Let his left hand be under my head, and his right hand embrace me. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the hinds of the field, that you do not arouse or awaken my love until she pleases. Sorry, I realized I only put half of it up there. All right, so it starts off, I've color coordinated the different speakers best I can figure out. There's a lot of discussion and a lot of debate over who's saying what, but some of it's generally pretty clear. It starts off, like we've already said, all the love poetry of the ancient Near East is the woman speaks twice as much as the man, which you can see as we go through this. The color coordinating will make it real clear. But it gets like right into this, just how much she loves him, right? May he kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, how sweet his love is to her. You get into this, and like the language used, it's likely talking about like the sexual aspect of their relationship already. Like this book like kind of gets into the beauty of intimacy and how much she thinks of it, how much she thinks of him and their relationship together. This might throw us as we read this. There's a lot of language they use. They call each other brother and sister. There's a lot of kingly language. And so people say, oh, it's definitely talking about Solomon. But in reality, it's like, there's love songs today. Taylor Swift wrote a love song, King of My Heart. Like this kind of language, it articulates something in poetry. We have to remember we're reading poetry. And this idea of the king or Solomon, like the curtains of Solomon, the chariots of Pharaoh, the king was at his table. There's more language. This is just these 14 verses or 13 verses. This is just language articulating how she sees him. He's number one, right? There's only one king. He is the king in her mind. She thinks so highly of him. And so, it's just, again, it starts off pretty straightforwardly praising the love and the ideals of love she has for him. And then in blue here we have the chorus speaking, which seems to be these daughters of Jerusalem. I've heard one commentator call them city girls. She's a country gal. She's on the vineyards and the fields. But like sons of the prophets in Elijah's day, it didn't mean they were literally the sons of the prophets. It meant they were people of the prophets. They were the prophets and they cared about the prophets. They were from the prophets. Here, daughters of Jerusalem doesn't literally mean, it just means that they were from the city. They're city girls. uptown girls, if you will. He said, they say, we will rejoice in you and be joyful. We will praise your love more than wine. And then it seems like the girl breaks back in, rightly do they love you. So even all the girls are praising her beloved. She doesn't just love him, he is a catch, right? And she's like, yeah, they should. You're awesome. Of course they praise you. You're the best one around. And then she gets into this, again, I point out Daughters of Jerusalem. She starts describing herself. And she describes, it's funny because this poetry gets kind of has a narrative element to it, although the narrative serves the poetry more than the poetry the narrative. We don't know why the brothers were mad, is what I mean. There's it's not the full story here. But because they're mad at her, she got put out in the vineyard and she couldn't take care of her own vineyard, which the word vineyard in this book is kind of it's a meaning for her body, like just in general. That's why, there's all this wordplay throughout this. Do not stare at me because I'm dark, for the sun has stared at me. It's kind of like the wordplay here. You can't look at me because the sun's looked at me all day, and now I'm burnt, I had to take care of these vineyards. I couldn't take care of my own vineyard. And she's self-conscious about it, right? There's a kind of this, especially in these first sections from the woman's voice, you're going to see a lot of kind of self-consciousness, a lot of anxiety, I suppose. Maybe not that's too strong a word. Just kind of self-consciousness is probably the only real word for it. But at the end, as she starts to talk about this, where she's been and what she looks like, she says, tell me, where do you pasture your flock? Where do you have it lie down at noon? She's looking for him again. Already we're seeing this kind of losing and finding, right? And she said, in this business about why should I be as one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? There's this, again, we're looking into the time of the day. It's hard to figure out what all this means specifically, but it seems like, she wants to know where he is so she can find him, is the bottom line with this section. And then the chorus breaks back in and says, go find him. He's kind of like chiding her, like, hey, don't ask us, just why don't you go find him yourself? That's part of it. We all have to go through these things. You go find him. This is your problem, lady. This is the Ben translation of this. And then the guy breaks in, and after all of her kind of, self-consciousness, what does he say about her? To me, my darling, you are like my mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. Your cheeks are delightful with jewelry, your neck with strings of beads will make for you jewelry of gold with beads of silver. Big words for a shepherd, I don't know if he could really afford all this gold and jewelry. But hey, guys aren't always known for keeping their promises about these things. But I think there is some kind of just beauty, like how beautiful she is to him. There's a lot. There's so much subtext in all of this, but that's kind of the whole point of these songs to some extent, like many love songs. But you can see kind of the back and forth, and the role the chorus starts to play in connecting the lovers together. And while they're looking for each other, she's full of self-consciousness, but he comes in and affirms her immediately. And then she affirms her love, she's attracted to him. She wants to be close to him. And this last line I saw a commentator translate it differently. I thought it made more sense, even though it's still uncomfy to talk about in a Bible class. Instead of my beloved is to me a pouch of myrrh which lies all night between my breasts. It's kind of the idea of she's saying she's looking forward to him sleeping in the bed with her, just being close together, sharing a bed. And to me, it makes more sense of this because this whole section, if you remember from the overall summary of the book, it's about anticipation. Again, I think they're married already, but I think this section of the song is articulating a section of anticipation where they're looking for each other and they're longing for each other, looking forward to being together, and she's looking forward to just him being with her. And so she says these things because, she's just attracted to him and she wants him to be with her. And he, again, affirms it, right? And as this section kind of gets to the second half, it starts to kind of get quicker in rhythm, where she has a short section and he has one verse. How beautiful you are, my darling, how beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves. Whatever that means. We should try some of these compliments, Your eyes are like doves. Many opinions about what this could mean, but I think if you kind of think about it poetically, you can kind of get the concept maybe. That's just what it is. Some of this imagery we have to, even the commentators are could mean that she has gentle eyes. I was like, you don't know what you're talking about, dude. We're all trying to figure out what that means, but it has some kind of poetic, Anyway, and then she comes back and says, how handsome you are, my beloved. I think this section kind of talks about the picture of the trees and being underneath the trees and all the flowers. It kind of gives us a picture that they're outdoors, like they're at a picnic, or like they are together underneath a tree. You know, it's like kind of this, it starts to, the language around it is, I don't know, it's just, I think it's talking about maybe like, yeah, stuff like that. And then she says, I'm the rose of Sharon. This is kind of like, it seems like this is kind of almost like a humble thing. I'm a flower among many flowers. I'm the lily of the valley. I'm one of the roses. You know, maybe she's kind of fishing for a compliment. You know, she's kind of being humble, and he says, no, you are the lily among thorns. There's nothing else. There's nobody else. You're the only one. So is my darling among the young women. And she comes back and takes his idea and restates it like an apple tree, more likely an apricot tree, because there's not any apple trees there, or some kind of fruit tree that is indigenous. Nonetheless, she says, so is my beloved among the young men. And it goes on, and as this section starts to kind of wear on, it's like he has brought me into his banquet hall. This is a word definitely for places where wine is drunk. And it seems to me that it seems to be the idea in general is that he's starting to make her feel intoxicated with her love. Like the way that he is, the way he looks, the way she feels about him is intoxicating to her. She needs to be, his banner over me is love. We sing this in a hymn, funny enough. And no one knows, it's actually a bad translation, which is hilarious. Because we just put this in a hymn because it kind of sounds cool, but actually, the word in the original language, it's like you can put up a banner or you can look at a banner. It's kind of the same word, apparently. I don't know, maybe I'll explain that very well. And so really what this probably more likely means is that he looked at me with love. His intention for me was love. It's like you could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at me. And it made her lovesick, is the impact it had on her. And she starts to talk about him embracing her. And then it kind of breaks into, swear to me, you daughters of Jerusalem, don't disturb or awaken love until it pleases. I think the my there is not helpful. I think it's don't disturb or awaken love until she pleases is the idea. And it's interesting because as a section is so full of anticipation, and it seems like their conversation gets quicker and it builds up, and then she kind of breaks in and says, hey, make sure that you don't awaken love until it pleases. It's a striking way this first section kind of comes to a sudden end, I feel like. That's how I read it anyway. And it's funny, as she talks about the beauty of love and how kind of overwhelming and how much it overtakes and how important it is to her, she wants to make sure that kind of the readers, and I think everybody, doesn't get carried away and that we understand that this is special in the ways it's supposed to be special. Don't just, don't ruin this. If you ruin this, it won't be this way. Or if, Anyway, I know it's a quick little lecture to that section. There's so many things overlooked in that, but I think that's a general understanding of how, what's going on in this story. I wanted to kind of run us through and lecture through a section so we could appreciate how to read it, maybe. I hope that's helpful. Does any questions about how the language or all that, how we went through that? Kim?
So, I noticed in different translations, they have different breakdowns of when.
Yeah.
Is that something we've added, the her and him and
Yeah.
okay. So originally it's just straight text
block
and
of
there's no
language.
division?
Yeah, and we understand it by because Hebrew and Greek both have feminine and masculine, and so we understand a lot of it from that. But then besides that, we're kind of piecing it together based on context clues. And so what I've highlighted is a commentator that I liked. It's this guy. His commentary is pretty straightforward. If you want to get it for yourself, it's a New American Commentary. His name is Dwayne Garrett. You can read, the thing is, Song of Solomon commentaries, there are a bunch of them, and they all kind of have a little different opinion on who speaks where. So I should have said that. This is not gospel truth, who's speaking where. But to me, it's the most sensible way to read it, all right? You have to be real, humility is paramount in this because there's not a lot of things we can be absolutely sure about. Remember a couple weeks ago we talked about there's 10% of the words in this book are only used once and only in this book. And another 10% are used 3 or 4 times in the whole Bible. And so there's all these difficulties in translation. That's a really good question. Any other questions just about kind of reading this or parsing through the language or appreciating it? I think that this, I don't know, there's so much to say. It's hard to talk about these and have discussions about these because it just, I think, immediately takes us to the personal. It's like what poetry is supposed to do. And so many of our Bible classes are about history or about narrative or about law. Like that's what most Bible classes are. And then we have this book that is some of the purest poetry in the Bible. The Psalms are poetry, but even they are like teaching a lot of times. This book isn't really teaching. It's highlighting and showing the ideal and doing it with poetry, which is really the only way to do this. Because if I asked you to tell the story of your love, would you tell it in like chronological order? Would you tell it how would you tell it? And even if you did tell it in kind of beat by beat, minute by minute history, would that be the truest way to articulate the love you have for somebody? Or is there a truer way where there's this kind of moments that accentuate or articulate something that's truer and more significant than the kind of timeline would? I don't know. Maybe I'm too much of a romantic, but I think that this story, this poem, highlights this in a way that is truer than a timeline or law or history or narrative would on its own. I think the song, being poetry, is something we still try to do, want to do, or if we don't feel like we're very artistic or poetic, we appreciate that other people do it. And so, I wanted to take us through and lecture through I had a whole other section to lecture through. It's too much for tonight. So we'll be playing catch up for the rest of the year. But the two questions I had at the end of this one was, what sticks out to you about how the beloved speak to each other, and what role does the chorus seem to play? And why does she tell the city girls not to awake love until she pleases? And how does that fit into its immediate context? All right, next week we'll definitely look at 2:8, 3 through 5. And I hope they'll also look at 3:6 through 5:1. The book's so short, I just encourage you to read the whole book between this week and next week. But there's not going to be as many discussion questions for this because there's going to be more lecturing in this class. I thought that would be more appropriate and more helpful, possibly. But I do want to have discussion if you all want it. If you want to ask questions, please do. And I have put a couple discussion questions in there because I think it is good to have some discussion about the significance, but I don't necessarily want to discuss all the details, if that makes sense. So that's my approach. I really appreciate your attention. I hope this is helpful. And appreciate you all.